Johnny Depp emerged from the grand entrance of a luxury hotel, the towering glass monoliths of downtown stretching overhead. The urban hum of the city was everywhere, car horns blaring in the distance, the chatter of pedestrians and the faint rumble of construction work far off. Dressed in his signature eclectic style, sunglasses perched on his nose, Johnny made his way toward the sleek black limousine waiting at the curb. His chauffeur, Thomas, a tall man in his 50s, stood by the vehicle with practiced efficiency. As Johnny approached, Thomas opened the rear door with a polite nod. "Good morning, Mr. Depp," he greeted. "I trust you had a pleasant stay?" Johnny smiled warmly. "Morning, Thomas. It was good, thanks. Looking forward to getting back home, but we still have one more stop for a photo shoot." Just as Johnny was about to slide into the plush leather interior of the limo, a small figure darted past him, moving with surprising speed. Before he could fully process what was happening, he felt something latch onto his leg. Looking down, he saw a little girl, completely bald, clinging to him with all her might. Her body trembled, and her eyes were locked on something in the distance, refusing to meet his gaze. Caught off guard, Johnny gently placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Hey there," he said softly, trying to catch her eye. "Are you all right?" Before the girl could respond, an angry shout sliced through the air. Her grip on Johnny's leg tightened for a moment before she abruptly let go, vanishing into the crowd of pedestrians. A red-faced man in his 40s, wearing an apron with the logo of a nearby convenience store, approached Johnny, his eyes still fixed on the direction the girl had run. He didn't even realize who he was addressing at first. "That little brat," the man spat, his voice thick with bitterness. "She's always hanging around my store, scaring away customers. Brings nothing but bad luck, I tell you." Johnny raised an eyebrow, a mixture of concern and curiosity crossing his face. "Has she actually done anything wrong? Stolen something?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with a hint of challenge. The store owner, still worked up, continued, "No, she hasn't stolen anything, but she just strolls through the aisles, touching everything. Always touching, never buying. It's unsettling, I tell you. My regulars don't like it and neither do I. I think it's all part of her plan. Biding her time until I let my guard down and she steals something." Johnny nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said, his voice soft but firm, "I've learned in my life that it's not wise to judge people for crimes they haven't committed. Maybe there's more to her story than you think." With that, Johnny turned and slid into the waiting limousine. Thomas closed the door behind him, muffling the store owner's final, bitter mutter. "I don't like you celebrities anyway. Never care about what's really going on in the world." As the limousine pulled away, Johnny leaned back in his seat, his mind still on the strange encounter. The girl's frightened eyes and the store owner's misplaced anger lingered in his thoughts, even as the city sped past outside the window. When they merged into the morning traffic, Johnny leaned forward, addressing his chauffeur. "Thomas," Johnny said, his voice tinged with urgency, "can you drive a bit slower than usual? I want to keep an eye out for something." Thomas nodded, adjusting his speed. "Of course, Mr. Depp. Is everything all right?" Johnny's eyes swept the streets through the tinted windows, scanning the faces on the sidewalk. "I'm not sure," he muttered, brow furrowed in focus. "There was a child back there. I need to make sure she's okay. She's bald, about 9 or 10 years old." "Surely, sir," Thomas responded with reassurance, his calm presence offering Johnny a small comfort as he kept his eyes peeled for the girl. The city's landscape rolled by at a slower pace now. Bustling sidewalks filled with commuters, street vendors setting up their carts, and the occasional tourist group already out exploring. Johnny's gaze darted between faces, his eyes searching for any sign of the small bald head. Just as he was about to give up, he spotted her. A familiar figure huddled against the wall outside a convenience store just a block away. "Thomas," Johnny said urgently. "Pull over here, please." The limousine glided to a smooth stop and Johnny stepped out onto the sidewalk, his sunglasses still in place. He approached the girl slowly, not wanting to startle her. She sat on the ground with a small paper cup in front of her, seeking donations. Her posture was slumped, as if drained by exhaustion and resignation. But as Johnny drew near, her eyes lit up with recognition. "Hello again," Johnny said softly, crouching down to her level with a gentle smile. He reached into his wallet and pulled out several large bills, placing them in her cup. The girl's eyes widened at the generous donation, and without warning she lunged forward, wrapping her arms around Johnny's leg. "Thank you," she exclaimed, her voice muffled against his pants. Then pulling back slightly, she looked up at him with wonder in her eyes. "Are you Captain Jack Sparrow? Where's your ship?" Johnny couldn't help but chuckle, her innocent enthusiasm warming his heart despite the sadness of her situation. "Well, love," he replied, slipping into his Jack Sparrow voice, "the Black Pearl is anchored in a secret cove, waiting for her next adventure. But tell me, what's a brave little pirate like yourself doing out here all alone?" The girl's smile faltered slightly, and she glanced around nervously before looking back at him. "Captain Jack Sparrow," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please help me." Johnny's hand moved instinctively toward his wallet again, but the girl shook her head vigorously. "Not money," she said, her eyes pleading. "I need—" Before she could finish her sentence, a small crowd began to gather, fans recognizing Johnny and rushing forward with phones in hand, eager for pictures. Some murmured questions, speculating about what the celebrity was doing with the homeless girl. The girl flinched, shrinking back as the attention overwhelmed her, the crowd unintentionally jostling Johnny as they vied for his attention. Johnny instinctively stepped back, his calm demeanor barely faltering. "Thomas," he called, and the chauffeur swiftly intervened. "All right, folks, give him some space," Thomas said firmly, his imposing presence cutting through the chaos. He guided Johnny back to the limousine and opened the door, ushering him inside. As the door shut behind him, Johnny glanced back out the window, concern deepening in his gaze as the girl disappeared into the crowd. "Mr. Depp," Thomas said gently, "I'm sorry, but we should go. You're on a tight schedule." Johnny didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the busy street, distant and preoccupied. "Yeah," he murmured finally. "I heard you." He turned away from the window, a quiet promise forming in his mind. "I'll be back," he whispered to himself under his breath. As the car started to move again, Johnny's phone rang. He answered quickly, the event organizer confirming the photo shoot details. After ending the call, Johnny turned to Thomas, his expression determined. "We've got a few minutes. Let's go back." Johnny's eyes narrowed as he looked at Dr. Marvey, his resolve unwavering. "Money is not a concern," he said, his voice firm yet compassionate. "I want her to have every chance, every opportunity to fight this. Whatever it takes, do what's necessary." Dr. Marvey nodded, a look of both relief and respect crossing his face. "Thank you, Mr. Depp. We'll begin preparations immediately. The team is ready to proceed once we have the final green light from you." Johnny glanced at Miss Abigail, her expression a mixture of gratitude and awe. "We'll make sure Sonia gets everything she needs," he reassured her gently, his gaze steady. "This is not just about a treatment. It's about giving her a life, a future." Miss Abigail took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly together. "You don't know how much this means, Mr. Depp," she said softly. "Not just for Sonia but for all the children here. You're giving them hope when it seemed like there was none left." Johnny gave a small nod, a flicker of emotion in his eyes, but he remained focused on the task ahead. "We're going to make this happen," he said with quiet determination. As Dr. Marvey moved to finalize arrangements with the hospital staff, Johnny took a moment to gather his thoughts, a sense of responsibility weighing heavily on him. His life had been filled with fame, fortune, and chaos, but here in this sterile hospital corridor, it was clear that none of that mattered. What mattered now was the life of a little girl who had fought her battle in silence, hidden behind the mask of a brave smile. He made his way to the waiting room to retrieve the items he had brought for Sonia. Returning to room 207, he gently knocked before entering. Inside, Sonia lay in a hospital bed, looking fragile but awake, her large eyes tracking his every movement as he stepped into the room. "Hey there," Johnny said softly, his voice light as he approached her bedside. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the small golden pirate coin, placing it in her hand. "I thought you might like this." Sonia's eyes widened as she looked at the coin, her fingers closing around it, almost protectively. "Is this for me?" she whispered, her voice still weak but filled with a mix of awe and joy. Johnny smiled, his expression warm. "Yeah. It's a little piece of something magical. I used to wear one just like it when I played Jack Sparrow. Figured you could use some magic of your own right now." Sonia's lips parted slightly as she looked up at him. "You're really Jack Sparrow?" Johnny chuckled softly. "The one and only." She smiled faintly, a hint of mischief in her eyes, despite the pain and exhaustion she was feeling. "Can I be a pirate too?" "Of course," Johnny replied with a wink, pulling out the Jack Sparrow hat he'd retrieved earlier. He placed it gently on her head, making sure it sat just right. "Pirates stick together. And you, little lady, are the bravest one I know." Sonia's face lit up, a true smile emerging for the first time since the fall. "A pirate," she whispered in awe, her small hands adjusting the hat. "I like that." Miss Abigail, who had been quietly watching from the corner of the room, stepped forward, her voice filled with emotion. "Thank you, Mr. Depp. I can't imagine how much this means to her." Johnny nodded, his gaze softening as he turned to Miss Abigail. "It's nothing," he said quietly. "She deserves this, and so much more." The room fell into a brief silence, the weight of the situation settling around them, but for a moment, the atmosphere lightened with the presence of a shared understanding. Johnny knew he couldn't undo the hardships Sonia had faced, but at least he could give her a chance to fight to live. That was all that mattered. As the minutes ticked by, Johnny stayed by Sonia's side, talking to her about the adventures of pirates and the mysterious seas. He shared stories of his travels, of treasure hunts and forgotten islands, all the while watching her gradually relax, the tension in her body easing as she listened. For the first time in a long while, Sonia allowed herself to believe in something greater than her illness. When the doctor returned with the final details, Johnny stood and addressed him directly. "Let's move forward with the surgery as soon as possible. Whatever it takes, we start now." Dr. Marvey nodded. "We'll begin preparations immediately, Mr. Depp." As Johnny turned to leave, he glanced at Miss Abigail, offering a reassuring smile. "I'll be here. We'll get through this together." The room was filled with a sense of quiet resolve, the journey ahead uncertain but full of hope. And as Johnny made his way out of the hospital, he knew that the road ahead was long and difficult, but for the first time in years he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Johnny nodded, his expression resolute. "I understand. Please go ahead with whatever Sonia needs. I'll cover all expenses, and I'd appreciate it if we could keep this as private as possible to avoid unnecessary media attention." The doctor nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "Of course, Mr. Depp. Patient confidentiality is our priority." He paused, then continued. "Given the severity of Sonia's condition, we have a surgery slot available tomorrow morning. We should proceed quickly." Johnny and Miss Abigail exchanged a brief glance before nodding in agreement. "Let's do it," Johnny said. "What do we need to prepare?" The doctor explained the pre-surgery procedures and consent forms in detail, and Johnny listened closely, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. The urgency of the situation weighed heavily on him, but his determination to help Sonia kept him focused. With the surgery scheduled, Johnny took a deep breath, then made his way to Sonia's room. He entered quietly, clutching the pirate hat and coin in one hand, the DVD in the other. As he sat beside her bed, Sonia's eyes brightened at the sight of him. She looked fragile in the sterile hospital bed, but her smile was wide. "Captain Sparrow," she exclaimed weakly, her voice full of excitement. Johnny grinned warmly, slipping into his Jack Sparrow persona with ease. "Hello, young pirate," he said. "I hear you're about to set sail on quite the adventure." Sonia's smile faded slightly as fear crept into her eyes. "The doctor said I need surgery," she whispered. "I'm scared. I'm not as brave as you." Johnny leaned in close, his voice soft yet firm. "Listen here, love. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means doing what needs to be done even when you're afraid. And from what I've seen, you're one of the bravest pirates I've ever met." He took her small hand gently in his. "The doctors are going to help you, Sonia. They're going to fight the sickness inside you just like we fight sea monsters on our adventures. And when it's all over, you'll be ready for new adventures. What do you say? Are you ready to be brave? Sonia hesitated, but after a moment she nodded. A determined look crossed her face. I'll try, Captain Sparrow. I promise. Johnny smiled and squeezed her hand. That's my girl. Now I've got something special for you. With a flourish, he placed the pirate hat on her head. It was a bit too big, slipping over her eyes, but the sound of her giggle made it worth it. And this, he said, pressing the golden coin into her palm, is for good luck. Keep it close and remember, Captain Sparrow's rooting for you. Sonia's eyes grew wide as she turned the coin over in her hands. It's beautiful, she whispered. Just then Miss Abigail entered, followed by a nurse pushing a small TV cart. Look what Mr. Depp arranged for us, Sonia, Miss Abigail said with a smile. Johnny grinned and winked at Sonia. How about we watch some real pirate adventures? He asked, holding up the DVD. Sonia's excitement flickered, but then she glanced at the 4 in her arm. But I can't eat anything before the surgery, she said, her voice a bit downcast. Johnny didn't miss a beat. But that's part of the adventure, he replied, leaning closer with a mischievous glint in his eyes. Even Captain Sparrow goes hungry sometimes. It's all part of being a true pirate. What do you say? Shall we brave it together? Sonia giggled and nodded, the earlier worry fading in the excitement of their impromptu movie night. As the opening credits began to roll, Johnny relaxed in his chair, grateful for the small, normal moment amidst the chaos. He watched as Sonia's eyes widened, engrossed in the swashbuckling scenes on screen. Halfway through the movie, Johnny leaned in, his curiosity piqued. Sonia, he asked gently, can I ask you something? Sonia glanced up at him, her eyes still bright with excitement. What? Why did you keep going into those stores if you weren't buying anything? Her expression turned serious as she paused the movie. It was always my dream to eat those snacks, she said quietly. We don't get treats like that at the orphanage. Just seeing all the colorful packages, it made me feel like I could have a normal life someday. She smiled slightly. Plus, the air conditioning was nice. My skin doesn't itch so much, at least until the owners got mad and kicked me out. Johnny's heart clenched at her words. His mind raced with ways to make her dreams come true, and he silently vowed to speak with Miss Abigail about improving the orphanage's conditions. He would do what he could to help other children like Sonia. As the movie continued, a nurse came in to take final measurements and blood samples for Sonia's surgery. Sonia barely noticed, too absorbed in the film. Johnny, meanwhile, found himself sharing behind-the-scenes stories from his film sets, delighting in her laughter and her eager questions. For a few precious hours, the hospital room transformed into a world of pirates and movie magic. As the movie neared its end, Johnny noticed Sonia's eyelids growing heavy. By the time the credits rolled, she was fast asleep, the pirate hat tilted slightly on her head, the golden coin still clutched tightly in her hand. Johnny carefully moved to the small couch, careful not to wake her, and turned off the TV. He gazed at Sonia's peaceful face, the soft beeping of machines a gentle background to his thoughts. The events of the day rushed back to him. The photo shoot he had missed, the potential career fallout, but none of it mattered. Not compared to the little girl sleeping before him. As he drifted off to sleep, Johnny made a silent promise. He would do whatever it took to help Sonia overcome this battle. She deserved a chance at life, a chance at adventure just like every other child. The first light of dawn filtered through the blinds when Johnny awoke, stiff from his uncomfortable sleep on the couch. He blinked, disoriented, before the events of the previous day came rushing back to him. He immediately looked to Sonia's bed and found her already awake, gripping the pirate coin in her small hand. "Good morning, Captain Jack," Sonia said softly, a brave smile on her face despite the fear still evident in her eyes. Johnny moved to her side and gently adjusted the pirate hat, which had slipped askew during the night. "Good morning, my brave little pirate," he replied warmly. "Ready for your big adventure today?" Before Sonia could respond, the door opened and a team of medical professionals entered. Led by Dr. Marvey, a renowned oncologist with kind eyes and a reassuring demeanor, they began preparing for her surgery. As they checked her vitals, Miss Abigail arrived, slightly out of breath. She immediately took Sonia's free hand, her voice filled with both concern and encouragement. "Good morning, sweetheart," Miss Abigail said. "Dr. Marvey is going to take excellent care of you today. Do you remember what we talked about?" Sonia nodded, squeezing both the coin and Miss Abigail's hand. "They're going to make me sleep and then they'll take out the bad stuff in my body," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Dr. Marvey smiled. "That's right, Sonia. And when you wake up, you'll be on your way to feeling much better." As the nurses prepared to move Sonia to the operating room, Johnny noticed the fear returning to her eyes. Without hesitation, he moved closer, taking her hand from Miss Abigail's. "Hey there, first mate," he said softly in his Jack Sparrow voice. "Remember what we talked about last night? About being brave?" Sonia nodded, her eyes locked on his. "Well, this is your chance to show how brave you are," he continued. "And do you know what? I'll be right here waiting for you when you wake up, just like a faithful captain waiting for his first mate to return from a dangerous mission. What do you say?" Sonia took a deep breath, visibly calming herself. I, Captain," she whispered, managing a small smile. Johnny gave her hand one last squeeze before the nurses wheeled her away, his encouragement continuing in pirate-inspired words. At the operating room doors, Sonia's fear resurfaced, and she reached out for Johnny, her small hand trembling. Johnny knelt beside her gurney. "You've got this, Sonia," he said with conviction. "Captain Jack Sparrow believes in you. And when you wake up, we'll have more adventures together. I promise." The pre-surgery medication began to take effect, and Sonia's grip loosened. With a sleepy nod, she was taken into the operating room. Johnny stood for a moment, staring at the closed doors, before turning to Miss Abigail. They shared a look of nervous anticipation before heading to the waiting area. As the hours stretched on, Johnny's phone buzzed with missed calls and messages from his agent, publicist, and business contacts. With a sigh, he silenced it, his focus entirely on Sonia. Miss Abigail, noticing his actions, gave him a sympathetic glance. "Mr. Depp," she began hesitantly, "I can't help but feel like we're imposing on you, your career, your obligations." Johnny shook his head. "Please, Miss Abigail. This is where I need to be. Everything else can wait." The day seemed to crawl by. Johnny paced, his eyes glued to the operating room doors. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Marvey emerged. His scrubs were stained with sweat, but his face held a cautious optimism. "The surgery was a success," he said, his voice full of relief. "We were able to remove the primary tumor and affected lymph nodes." Johnny and Miss Abigail embraced, their relief palpable. "Thank God," Miss Abigail whispered. Dr. Marvey's expression turned serious. "But this is just the first step. Sonia will need ongoing treatments, chemotherapy and possibly radiation, depending on how she responds." Johnny nodded, his resolve hardening. "Whatever she needs, doctor. Just tell us what to do next." As the doctor explained the next steps, a nurse informed them that Sonia was being moved to the recovery room. She would be groggy, but they could see her briefly. Johnny and Miss Abigail followed the nurse to the recovery area. As they approached Sonia's bed, they saw her stirring. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then settled on Johnny. "Captain Jack," she mumbled weakly. "Did I do it?" Johnny smiled and placed the pirate hat back on her head. "You did, Sonia," he said gently. "You were so brave." Sonia managed a weak smile before drifting back to sleep. Johnny, with a deep sense of fulfillment, leaned against the wall, feeling that for the first time in a long time he was exactly where he needed to be.